Okay, so I recently just rewatched the original Joker from 2019. I reviewed that on my channel if you want to look at it. In that video, I explained why I believe it's overrated. And since we're getting closer to Halloween, I was thinking, what's a highly praised horror movie that I may not be too fond of or straight up think is overrated? And then I was like, wait a minute. What better horror movie to talk about in terms of being overrated than Insidious from 2010, directed by James Wan, starring Patrick Wilson and Rose Byrne. Just as a heads up, I am sick, so if I sound a bit different, I apologize. Insidious has not aged well at all, and I call it overrated because it failed at its main goal, and that is to be scary. Now, horror is subjective. If you found this movie scary, you're not wrong for that, just like how I'm not wrong for not finding it scary. But throughout the video, I will be explaining my reasoning as to why I believe the scares used in the film were poorly executed on a technical level. But before we get into that, I do have to acknowledge things do get a bit complicated when you want to use the word overrated to describe Insidious. Do I think the horror elements in this movie are weak? Absolutely, 100%. But let's contextualize it. The time and setting when a movie comes out obviously plays a key factor in its initial reception and its legacy. And this movie's influence has been monumental, to say the least. Insidious is not the first time James Wan would have played a huge role in shifting horror cinema, and it wouldn't be the last. In fact, I would go so far to say James Wan saved us, because the 2000s, and a lot of people are going to disagree with this, especially millennials, but the 2000s were terrible for horror cinema, specifically American horror cinema. We had a few bangers here and there. We had Paranormal Activity trying to carry the torch of the Blair Witch Project, but other than that, we really just got this big revitalization of the slasher genre with just a bunch of exploitation and extremism. Talking about the Hills Have Eyes remakes, The Wrong Turns, The Human Centipede, those Hostel movies. I'm not saying any of those are terrible, but that type of horror, for the most part, it's not for me. Amongst all this gore and torture schlock, Insidious at the time was a breath of fresh air. Where instead of using gore to try and discomfort the audience as a sort of shock value type of horror, Insidious had no gore, no violence, and it went for more of a eerie, sinister type of route. The atmosphere is creepy and foreboding rather than bleak and gross like a lot of the 2000s horror movies were. Instead of trying to horrify you with disgusting, full despair images and scenarios, this movie felt like it was trying to truly terrify you. And at the time, it was successful. But the way that it did it was a double-edged sword. Because although yes, the movie has basically become the blueprint for all the mainstream horror movies that we've been getting since then, specifically Blumhouse, however, it's also the root cause for the biggest problem in horror today, and that is the jump scares. This movie has an absurd amount of jump scares. I kid you not, I lost count, there's at least 20. Which, yes, for a movie that's not even 2 hours long, that is a lot of fucking jump scares. The first act is relatively tame, at least compared to the second act, and that's why the first act is the better act, but my god. They become so prevalent and so predictable, and thereby very quickly becoming annoying. Very annoying. Every single one is accompanied by this stupid ass soundbite. The stock violin noise, the dun. I kid you not, there's one jump scare where someone literally blinks and you hear the sound dun. So obnoxiously repetitive that the movie loses any and all tension. The movie has no sense of restraint or trying to build on its sinister atmosphere, or terrify us with any well-executed, unique scares. It accomplished some of that in the first act of the movie when it was a bit more reserved, like the iconic scenes I say still hold up. The tiptoeing scene had a better setup than a payoff. The iconic jump scare, I thought that was a good jump scare. Again, no spoilers, but if you know the scene I'm talking about, you know the scene I'm talking about. Eventually it just becomes a barrage of loud, frequent, predictable pop-up sounds with no sense of danger, no sense of dread, no sense of anything to be scared of. But also doesn't help this movie in terms of being scary for me. Not just the frequent, predictable jump scares, but the conditioning of not feeling threatened by anything at all. This movie shows us time and time again that after every single scare, there's no consequence of that scare. The demons pop up, scare us, along with the protagonist, and then they just fuck off until the next scary scene happens. I wouldn't mind a couple of those in the first act of your movie. A lot of horror movies do that where they need to establish to the audience, hey, we can scare you at any time, keep us on our toes. But this happens literally over and over and over again throughout the entire movie we never really feel like our characters are in danger. There's no stakes at all. This movie, in a way, especially the final act, feels like a shitty Halloween haunted house tour. You know, you're walking around the house, you're following the pathway, there's, you know, creepy, spooky decorations here and there. Around the corner, you see some dipshit with the Spirit Halloween mask. He jumps out and scares you, you're like, ah, and you're like, oh my god, you got me. You laugh it off, he crawls back in his corner, and you just keep walking. And you wait for the next guy to come out and scare you. And you wait for the next guy, and you're laughing, you're having a good time, you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. It's basically this movie. Like, yeah, it could be fun and thrilling in a real haunted house, but as a movie, it's annoying. You don't have to be The Wailing or The Shining or any other depressing, dark, psychological horror masterpiece to be considered a valid horror movie. You're allowed to be a fun, popcorn, jump scare horror movie, but just be a good one. The Conjuring is a great one. That one still holds up to this day because James Wan finally learned some self-restraint. When I said earlier that it's complicated to call Insidious overrated, that's because yes, these scares have not aged well at all, but this movie really was the first big jump scare movie to use jump scares the way that it did. So at the time, the audiences, they were not as conditioned as we are today. So in that context, it does make sense why so many people regard this as one of the scariest horror movies ever made. Then on the other side, you think there are so many other horror movies that came out decades before Insidious and they still hold up and they're still scary. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Alien, Exorcist, so I honestly don't know. Besides the horror aspects, this movie is a well-made movie. Both leads, talented actors, Patrick Wilson and Rose Byrne, they're good in this movie. Cinematography, although not as defined as it would be in the later James Wan films, you can still see a bit of James Wan in this film. The wide angles, a lot of the handheld usage. The story was also pretty good for a ghost story. They implemented some twists and turns, nothing insane, but I did like how they tried doing something more than just another Blaine haunted house story. I know I'm pretty hard on this movie. I don't despise it as much as it may sound like I do. This movie is a PG-13 horror movie, so I will give it props for that. For it to accomplish what it did and to be as effective as it was under those strict guidelines, that is impressive. If this was regarded as one of the scarier PG-13 horror movies, maybe I wouldn't be as hard on it, but it's not. There are grown adults that think that this movie is scarier than The Exorcist, which is fine. That's an opinion to have. You're not wrong for that. But with this movie's legacy and reputation, of course I'm going to critique it as a legitimate horror movie. Influential, iconic, literally shaped horror cinema as we have today. Unfortunately, time has not been kind to it at all. And this movie is not even 2 decades old. I would recommend you rewatch this movie just to see what the fuck I'm talking about. I'm giving Insidious a 5 out of 10. Its influence is saving this movie from being a 4 or even a 3. Okay, so for the similar recommendation, I'm gonna be going with The Autopsy of Jane Doe from 2016, directed by Andre Overdahl, starring Emile Hirsch and Brian Cox. So this movie takes place over the course of one night, and in this night we are following a coroner and his son, and they are tasked with uncovering the identity of a recently discovered deceased Jane Doe. And as they dissect the body, they're trying to figure out how this woman may have died, who she was, but they start unraveling things that offer more questions than answers. As the night goes on, things continuously get more eerie and strange, to say the least. This is a very underrated, awesome horror movie. It's my similar recommendation because it's very similar to the James Wan, Mike Flanagan style of horror. This is a jump scare popcorn movie, but it is a well-made, fun jump scare popcorn movie. The movie knows how to show restraint. It's not 24/7 jump scares. Some of them are creative, some of them are pretty good. Like a lot of horror movies we're getting, especially from the Blumhouse department, this movie's cinematography, its editing, there was some style to it. You can tell that there was some level of effort being put into that, which of course I could appreciate. It's got an engaging, slow burn mystery. Like, the story itself is definitely the best part, my favorite part of the movie, because along with the protagonist, us the audience, we're all trying to figure out, okay, what exactly is going on with this Jane Doe? The acting is good. I mean, you got Logan Roy in this, so obviously he's gonna be great. So I haven't seen this movie in a few years. Emile's the son. I remember there are some parts where I felt a little bit iffy on the performance, but for the most part, I think he was decent. There was never an immersive breaking moment where I could remember, oh, he was dog shit. Now, full warning, since in this movie we are following coroners for the most part, dissecting a body, this movie is not necessarily violent, but it is very gory. Not in the sense of Terrifier 3 where you're watching just butcher torture porn, but in this movie the props and the makeup are very realistic when it comes to the body itself being dissected and cut open. Very well made, very realistic, and they explicitly show it in close-up in full detail, which overall just adds to the overall unsettling, creepy atmosphere. So yeah, if you can stomach that and you're a fan of Insidious, I would highly recommend you watch this movie. Alright, that does it for my review and my cinema recommendation. Now for my next reviews, expect a big roundup, which is gonna have Smile 2, Kato Lake, Look Back, and I don't know if I will be able to do this, but I do want to do that top 10 horror movies by Halloween, so this Thursday. One of those may come out before the other, I'm not sure, but I do want to do a top 10 horror movies because I did say I wanted that to come out before October ends, but my schedule with my real job that I have with watching movies, catching up on movies, and doing my own editing, my schedule has just been so packed, but I really want to do this, so we definitely will have the top 10 horror movies of 2024 up this week. I just don't know if it'll be up before Halloween. But other than that, thank you so much to everybody who watched, and I'll see you at the next one.